Racism. Most likely, you clicked on this video one way or another to hear me talk about the politics and culture of racism. But that's not the problem here. The problem is the difference between numeracy and innumeracy. Numbers are cultural symbols. This is a very alien but very obvious fact. It seems strange to us to say that. Let's say it again. Numbers are cultural symbols. If you have two men who are both very skilled optometrists, they can summarize the way in which your vision is distorted in just 2 or 3 numbers. And those numbers really mean something to them. And they really understand what's represented by those numbers. In a physical sense, in terms of the shape of the lens of your eye, and in a much more complex sense, in terms of the way in which light passes through that lens, the way in which it's reflected, shaped, distorted, the way in which the nervous system within your eye receives that light and turns it into an image, and the very complicated way in which a pane of glass can interrupt and adjust that light to improve your vision. It all comes down to just a few numbers on a page, a few symbols. But if I'm looking at those numbers, I don't really know what they mean. What's going on with the revival of the race and IQ debate by Charles Murray? What's going on, frankly, with the revival of this particular form of scientistic racism is in principle built upon innumeracy, a failure to understand really what numbers mean, what they represent, how to think about them, especially in the domain of social science statistics.
I think you're onto something. But I got to come back to ground zero, Charles. Do you think black people are inferior genetically?
No.
Okay, well...
I'm laughing because that's such a silly question.
Tell me why it's a silly question, because that's a question that a lot of people are going to be asking me when they ask me, why did you have that guy on? He thinks black people are inferior.
Okay. Shall I unpack my answer a little bit?
Sure.
Okay. Are there genetic differences among people who self-identify as different ethnicities? Yes. The chances that different groups that are separated geographically would have evolved exactly the same is about the same as the chance of dropping a handful of silver dollars and they all land on their edge. You know, that's just not the way it works. If you have geographic boundaries, if you have other kinds of boundaries, and you're talking about tens of thousands of years, there is a lot of room for evolution to have taken place. I will simplify. Point number one is, it's certainly true, and we already know it's true, that there are lots of population differences in various genetic variants. That is not a controversial statement among geneticists. So yes, you have differences between groups. They do not determine your fate. They don't lend themselves to superiority, inferiority, because they're bundles. If you're going to use the word inferior and superior, then whites better get used to the idea that they're inferior to East Asians. But here's where the importance of differences within that top percentile have so much impact on life outcomes. I use the example in the book because you say to yourself, suppose you're at the 99th percentile of IQ. What difference does it really make if you're at the 99.5th? And the analogy I use is in sports, male basketball ability.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? If you just have a measure of male basketball ability, probably every starter on every college basketball team in a major school in the country is in the 99th percentile. So is LeBron James. Well, you know what? There is a huge difference within that top percentile. And the same is also true. Somebody at the 99th percentile of IQ is a smart person. Somebody at the 99.9th can do things that the person at the 99th percentile can't do. And so it's a very small chunk of the population But if you're looking at who is on the staffs of the quantitative hedge funds in New York City, making zillions of dollars, they are overwhelmingly people who are out at the 99.9th percentile. And that being the case, given the differences in cognitive ability, that means they are Asians and they are whites overwhelmingly.
Well, a lot of them are Jewish, Charles.
Yeah, and a lot of them are Jewish.
Have you ever heard someone tell you that Bob Dylan is a genius? For some younger people in the audience, or maybe I have some viewers who grew up in some other part of the world where Bob Dylan is not a famous name, you could replace the name Bob Dylan with almost any famous musician, any famous recording artist with a series of top 10 hits on the radio. Have you ever heard someone say that Bob Dylan is a genius? Have you ever watched a 30-minute interview with Bob Dylan? I'm going to suggest to you that Bob Dylan is not a genius. He is not a person of extraordinary intelligence by any meaningful measure whatsoever. You just heard Charles Murray suggest to you as a self-evident fact that successful hedge fund managers, this is basically a way to play the stock market. This is basically being a stockbroker. Within that field, a more specific role, a hedge fund manager. He referred to it as a self-evident fact that hedge fund managers are people of extraordinary intelligence. That they're not in the top 1%. But that they're in the top 1/10 of 1%. That they are superior to the rest of us in intelligence in the same way that the absolute greatest basketball player in the world towers over his competition. Have you ever watched a 30-minute interview with a hedge fund manager? Serious question. You can do it right now on YouTube. You can go to a podcast. You can hear a 3-hour interview with a successful hedge fund manager, and he talks to you about what he did in high school, and he talks to you about how he met his first wife, and how he cheated on her with a stripper, and how he got divorced, and how he became a cocaine addict, and how he used to be a Star Trek fan. And the more you listen to any successful hedge fund manager talk about their life, you are going to think, this person is not a genius. In the same way that you look at Bob Dylan, after you get to know the guy, after you've heard him talk about his divorce and his cocaine habit and what he did in high school and his whole life, as long as you heard him talk in a down-to-earth way, you'll start to realize, gee, what people perceive as genius in the case of Bob Dylan is really just a certain set of skills developed to a very high level of competence. And in the whole rest of this guy's life, there may be many areas of knowledge, many areas of expertise, many meaningful measures of intelligence in which he is average or mediocre or even really quite stupid. Have you ever heard a hedge fund manager talk about politics? I have. Have you ever heard a famous musician like Bob Dylan, like Britney Spears, like Lil Wayne talk about politics? I have. I've heard many hours of both. I used to listen to lectures from the London School of Economics that they upload. I didn't go there in person. I just mean they upload lectures to the internet. And I've heard people from all these walks of life and more talk about politics. And you know what the tragedy is? Guess who the most influential people in the world are in politics? Multi-millionaire hedge fund managers and famous musicians like Bob Dylan and Britney Spears, this kind of celebrity. And in an area like politics, we see the extent to which they stand on feet of clay. All right? What everyone wants to talk about is racism. In the year 2021, we have just sentenced the police officer, Derek Chauvin, to prison, the man who killed George Floyd. The flames of the riots that were inspired by the death of George Floyd have been doused out, and cities are being rebuilt coast to coast in the United States. Statues continue to be torn down here in Canada as Canada reflects on its own history of slavery, racism, and genocide. There's never been a better time to publish a book that's fundamentally race baiting, that's fundamentally playing to public fascination with precisely these kinds of questions, and that suggests to the audience a profoundly appealing myth of meritocracy. That the reason why Bob Dylan had hit songs, the reason why he became so good, not at playing his guitar. No, nobody would say Bob Dylan is extraordinarily good at playing his guitar. No one would say he is extraordinarily good at playing the harmonica. Nobody. He was good at interpreting the cultural trends that were going on around him in Greenwich Village, New York City, and in making the kind of song people wanted to hear, right? And there's a kind of intelligence there. But there's also a complex bundle of cultural presuppositions. There are very palpable reasons why an immigrant who had just arrived from Japan in Greenwich Village in New York City would be at a tremendous disadvantage compared to Bob Dylan at interpreting those cultural signals and putting together a hit album, a hit song. There are very palpable reasons why a newly arrived African immigrant, someone who just flew over from Ghana, let's say, to New York City, wouldn't be able to interpret those cultural signals and come up with a new style of music and hit albums on the airwaves. And the reason has nothing to do with the type of intelligence measured by IQ, and it has nothing to do with any property that is genetic if we're talking about the differences between people in the top 10%. And you've heard that Charles Murray, with his new thesis, is focusing on the top 1% and the top 1/10 of 1%. If we're talking at the bottom of the spectrum, which is really where a lot of the debate about public policy needs to be directed, then we're talking about a whole different set of issues. Well, if you're blind, you have a huge disadvantage. If you're dyslexic, you have a huge disadvantage. If you grew up with lead poisoning, because in your neighborhood there were lead pipes or pipes with lead soldering, lead welding around the edges, you're at a huge disadvantage. Oh, you didn't know that? Lead poisoning in your water, especially as you grow up, lowers your IQ. Oh, in the United States of America, do you think that's distributed equally between white people and black people? Oh, you didn't know that? Oh, black people in the United States of America have a much higher rate of lead poisoning and reduced IQ due to lead poisoning. You want to know someone else who grew up with lead poisoning in his drinking water? Me. My neighborhood, where I grew up in Toronto. All the water I drank out of the tap, and every day my parents took that frozen canned orange juice that nobody drinks anymore, mixed it up with tap water. I had lead poisoning impair my mental development as a child, and we'll never know how intelligent I might have been if the government of Canada, if the government of the city of Toronto had just given a damn and installed the pipes properly, if I hadn't grown up with that disadvantage. We don't know. At the low end, when you're looking at the bottom 10%, when you're looking at the characteristics that cause people to fail an IQ test, to be incapable of writing an IQ test at all, that cause people to be incapable of going to university at all, incapable of doing math, incapable of reading, incapable of learning to play a musical instrument, there are factors there that profoundly skew the significance of averages, of average numbers, and what those average numbers mean. And when we're looking at representations of intelligence, of educational accomplishment, and so on, in masses of people, in millions and millions of people, we are looking at the very same factors that make it impossible for someone to get a driver's license, impossible for someone to get and keep a job. And then that's going to turn up in the averages for that population as a whole. So if you have two different ethnic segments of the population, and one is living in poverty and the other isn't, one has worse access to education, one has better, one has a higher rate of alcoholism, a higher rate of drug addiction than the other, a higher rate of lead poisoning. All of those factors are going to show up in those statistics. But what Charles Murray wants us to do is to instead focus at the upper limit, at the extremes of what he calls intelligence. And it's in that area precisely that this notion of quantifying intelligence, of assigning these numbers, assigning these cultural symbols to things, and then presuming that we know what it means, starts to become most absurd, starts to become most laughable. Why was Bob Dylan more successful as a musician than 100 other people who were in Greenwich Village, New York City, at that same time trying to write songs? Was it really because he was more intelligent? Was it really because he had more intelligence as measured by the IQ test? Was it because he was Jewish? What a really absurd notion to try to reduce the accomplishment, the artistic creativity, and the cultural salience of what Bob Dylan did to his ethnicity as Jewish, or the relationship between his ethnicity and what you say IQ tests measure or prove, right? And by the way, what was the original idea that Bob Dylan had again? Oh, right. He imitated African American music. He was a white guy doing white New York City cover versions of African American folk music, African American early blues music, and then he took it off in his own direction. And by the way, after that, his career only went downhill from there. That was the magic of Bob Dylan. There are quite a few other early white top 10 artists in American rock and roll about whom we could say the same thing. This is the genesis of Elvis Presley. It's actually imitating and co-opting African American culture and making it more palatable to, making it more acceptable to a white mass market audience. Okay. What does it take to be successful on the stock market? What are the characteristics, what are the advantages that make you really successful as a stockbroker or specifically as a hedge fund manager? And how do those correlate to intelligence by any particular measure? All right. It may seem laughable to you. Oh, it may seem ridiculous for me to suggest that the cultivation of a specialized skill in interpreting economic data has just as little to do with intelligence in a meaningful sense as cultivating the ability to look at a bunch of black lines on a piece of paper and in your own mind hear the music. An idiot could do it. Incredibly stupid people learn how to read sheet music and learn how to focus their mind and use their creativity to improve a composition on a sheet of paper, right? To look at a bunch of charts, to look at a bunch of economic equations and hear that music. It doesn't take a genius. It doesn't even take extraordinary intelligence of any kind. And if you just listen to interviews with these guys who are successful stockbrokers and successful hedge fund managers, reflecting on other things in their life, reflecting on politics, reflecting on society, you will realize that they are, for the most part, people of below average intelligence. but who were born into circumstances where they had the access to education that they needed to develop that set of skills, and were ultimately, just like Bob Dylan, they were lucky. They were lucky in putting together those opportunities in a way that a newly arrived immigrant from Japan, or a newly arrived immigrant from Africa, or someone who grew up in a drug-dealing infested ghetto in Los Angeles would be very unlikely to do. Maybe we can practice doing puppet show together.
Yes, that's all I needed. I need it all.